Hello, and welcome to a very exciting edition of our class in world religions, where we're going to be talking about reflexivity, the quest of religious studies, and my favorite topic, in which I'm actually sort of an expert, magic. And what exactly is magic? So we're going to move forth after this lesson. We're going to do a whole kind of thing on magic. It should be exciting. All right, so first off, Kripal's quest, Kripal's text. I mean, we've got our book, Comparing Religions, and we have this character, Jeffrey Kripal. And as I've said, he's a really innovative scholar. He's also a bit controversial. There are some arguments that would say that he's doing kind of an old school form of religious studies that seeks to have religious studies as personal religious development instead of explaining and making intelligible other people's religions. So that's going to be up for you to decide, but let's talk about it for a second. Okay, so Kripal argues that when we do religious studies, we have to bring to it a degree of reflexivity. When I say reflexivity, I mean looking back, sort of like looking at a reflection as if you were looking in a mirror, or responding to yourself and responding to oneself and understanding what they bring to every sort of attempt to engage and interpret religions. So when I say reflexivity, I say that the religious studies project requires reflexivity toward what we are doing, how we do it, and why we do this quest of religious studies. It's key to be reflexive as we think in order to evaluate and understand our process and try to move as openly as possible. When I say self-reflexivity, I mean that we need to be self-reflexive. What do we ourselves bring to the project? What does our gaze in looking at religions, how does that change us? So we need to bring ourselves and see what we bring to the project, and we need to see how the project changes us. What do we hope to take from the project? What are our clear takeaways? I always say that my goal in studying religion is to make the religions of other people intelligible. But if you were to ask other scholars in the field, even colleagues of mine, they would say that they do religious studies so they can understand, for instance, Tibetan Buddhism better, and inherently because they are Tibetan Buddhists themselves. So what about me, myself, I'm saying? So for me, I really worry about and I wonder about how my own religious upbringing affects the way that I come to religious studies. I also think about how when I get really interested in religious topics, it's generally because I find myself confused, a little bit befuddled. And in that confusion, I get this opportunity to try to do research and think about something to try to make religions more intelligible. But I want that intelligibility, that reason I give, or my understanding of this religious topic that confuses me, to in fact respect the interpretations of religious people. So I want to be able to give an intelligible understanding of religion that would be recognizable to people who are insiders, to people who are religious themselves. I would like to say that or at least I like to think, that I try to preserve lost voices and disrupt established voices. In fact, I'm always looking for différance. I'm looking for, as the French would say it, or difference. I'm not trying to bubble anything down to any one perspective or make grand arguments, but try to see things in context as best I can. So there's an argument within Kripal that a lot of people would make, and that we probably most of us think about. I don't agree with this, but about human sameness. The idea is we are all humans and we share the same consciousness. We all have the same human capabilities. And what we do as we express ourselves in culture is we express human consciousness. So that means when we think about culture, think about human consciousness. Now, what is one of the main drivers of culture? It's religion. But religion is found through culture. Religion isn't independent in any way. So what I'm trying to get at here is, if you posit that all people will have the same sort of basic interior processes, and if you argue that those processes are established through culture and religion is the main driver of culture, then you're going to see religion as sort of a universal sort of human move. But that doesn't account for just how different religions are. And I would also argue that this notion of religion as being this category in and its own, what we call a sui generis religion, existing in its own, doesn't really exist. Religion is always sort of interdependent. So you can't locate religion outside of a specific culture. If I say I want to study prayer, and I try to say that prayer is the same with Hinduism and Protestant Christianity, well, I'm not doing a good expression of Christianity, of understanding Christianity or understanding Hindu prayer, because the whole apparatus of it is different. So what do we do when we compare? And I love these lovely crocodiles and alligators here. Well, there's 4 steps. I keep saying this over and over again, and I will continue to keep saying it over and over again. The first step is collection and description. So you figure out what you're going to study. The next thing you do is you look at what you're going to study and you classify and name different patterns. The third step is you compare those 2 or 3 things, or maybe more things, in order to lead to some sort of general theory of or about religion. I'll model this for you once again in just a second. So I'm kind of more of the notion for human separation, so for difference or différance, as the French would say. We must study cultures in their own separate contexts, but we can also look at themes across those separate contexts. So if we only look at like little parts of culture, parts of religion, we're never going to see a whole. We can use parts to study the whole. We have to use parts to study the whole. The question is, for me, is there this bigger thing of religion that is the whole and that all these things are parts of, or are all these different religions completely separate and are not parts of some sort of whole, not some sort of universal human consciousness that's encountering itself, not part of the collective unconscious, as Carl Jung explains. And we can talk about the sins of Jung later. So do you buy it? I mean, do you buy it at all? Do you buy this Jeffrey Kripal argument? I don't, but you can. You might find it more convincing than I do. Religions can only be understood, I argue, in their local context. You need to learn everything about that local context. You need to learn the language. You need to learn the history. You need to learn the surrounding cultures. You need to learn about cultural interactions and so forth. But there is no sort of religious experience that's unmediated by culture. All religion happens with the culture already occurring and is all processed through that. So if I want to understand Islam, I have to figure out, okay, well, where do I want to look? Well, I want to look at Islam in South Asia. Okay, well, where? So, oh, it's in South India. They don't really do much with Arabic there. They mediate everything through the Tamil language. All right, well, what village? So I got to learn Tamil, and I should know some Arabic so I can look at the source text. And then I go to that one village. I say, well, how many Hindus are here? How many Muslims are here? How long have the Muslims been here? How does this community work? Is the religious site at a place that was previously from another religious site? Okay, now how do people go to those religious places? What do they do there? Every time I'm constantly looking to see how it is local, how it is very specific to an area. And I might look at the surrounding areas or surrounding themes, but I'm really trying to understand this religious expression as much as possible on its own. This is what I keep saying by I say human consciousness is always mediated. There's no raw, pure consciousness that sort of expresses itself in multiple ways to create the different religions. Themes and patterns might, repeat, and this is what we study in religion, is those themes and patterns. But when you claim humanity is essentially the same, and religious expressions are of some core common experience, then you're actually making a religious argument. So if all humanity is the same, and I'm looking at, say, prayer, and I'm looking at how it's done in Hinduism and Christianity, and I say that it's all just an expression of prayer, then I might as well be saying this is all ways that we get to the one same God, which is not what I would ever argue, because these gods are different. They're essentially different. So the rival textbook to Jeffrey Kripal's textbook that I was reading before when I decided to go with Kripal's was called God is Not One. God is not the same. God is different wherever you go. So we come back to Russell McCutcheon, seen here thinking. Do you remember Russell McCutcheon? We read an essay on the first lesson about what is religious studies, and he argued that religious studies and the academic study of religion should be the anthropologies of religions. So he argues that the only position that you can really use in religious studies is that of being an outsider. Well, what do I mean by outsider? An insider into religion would be one who was raised in a religion or had converted to that religion as a member of that religion. The outsider is just plain not. You were not raised of that culture. You did not convert to that culture. You remain outside. McCutcheon argues that religion is data, and that we as scholars interpret data. When we reproduce the insider perspective, so if I was, say, a Hindu and just talked to you constantly about the nature between man and God in Hinduism in a sort of normative way, then I'd just be reproducing the insider perspective. I'd just be doing theology. It's non-critical. If you want to understand anything, you have to step outside to some degree, and you need to look at the religions of other people. Otherwise, you're just looking at yourself and your own ideas. So one of the ways I like to think about this is that we are studying the religions of other people. Now, if we go to a church or seminary, we can talk about sort of essential normalizing truths, but as scholars, we can only talk about and how people make essential normalizing truths. So if I made an argument that, let's say, the Christian God is the one true God, a scholar is not going to go and try to argue that the Christian God is the one true God. They're going to go and argue about why and how Christian insiders would argue that there is only one God, and that's the Christian God. So religions are about other people. Religious phenomena are data. By standing outside of that data, we can understand that data. Now, I am not saying if you want to study Christianity, you can't be a Christian. I'm not saying that in any way. Or you have to be a non-Hindu to study Hinduism. You can still be an insider, absolutely in every way. But you don't bring that to your academic perspective. You don't bring that to your scholarly sort of pursuits. What you bring to a scholarly pursuit is a critical acumen to understand the data of religion. Another of Russell McCutcheon's famous books is called Critics, Not Caretakers. Our jobs in studying religion is to not caretake the fine treasures of the world that are considered religious, but to be social critics and critical historians. So there's another argument. There's a wonderful woman named Wendy Doniger O'Flaherty. She's Wendy Doniger now. She is Jeffrey Kripal's teacher. She's also my teacher's teacher. He's David White's teacher. I've mentioned her before. Now, she argues that via studying a wide range of cultures, both in their depths and their shadows, it's sort of like looking at a spider's web. So you can see all these intricate connections and whatnot, but you can't see the creator of the web. And she talks about this as the implied spider. So she's always looking at these structures in religion and culture, but she argues that you can never see the one who created it. So for instance, in folklore, you can find the Cinderella story all over the place. You can find it in like 5 different locations throughout, the history of Europe. That doesn't necessarily mean that one person wrote it and it was all connected, but you can see the web of connections. So if I was to say, look at Advaita Vedanta, that notion I said of non-dualism, I wouldn't be looking to find the essential truth that created Advaita Vedanta, but looking at all the different connections between the different people who argued about it to create the mosaic that is any culture. I find this notion of the implied spider to be really intriguing and poetic. So while I've said I don't quite buy Kripal's quest, but I sure like Kripal's text. I like our book that we're working with, and I think it's really quite good. And I think the work of comparison is sort of the most important aspect of thinking, especially thinking about religions. Now, Kripal has this really great argument that he talks about what is on the table and what is off the table. So, and this is really key. We create theories based on the data we consult. But we already have theories, which causes us to select the data we're going to look at. For instance, what books do I select that I'm going to read about in a certain time? What am I going to do when I walk into a village? What am I going to choose to look at? Am I going to look at food preparation? Am I going to look at scriptures that are being circulated by priests? Am I looking at temple practices? So based on my own interests, I know that I'm going to look at texts, and I know I'm going to look at temple practices. I'm not going to go look at the way foods are prepared locally. And so I'm probably going to make some sort of an argument about the relationship between text and temple practice. However, I could probably learn quite a bit more if I studied food practices and how those are even related. So the idea of what you put on the table and what you leave off the table dictates what you end up figuring out. Now, Kripal argues that we need to bring in all sorts of different ideas that we don't usually think about. For instance, usually people argue the difference in religion or in studying religion is, do you choose to study scripture or practice? Well, what about theory versus theology? What about customs? You can add that and you see a whole nother aspect. Now, what if you start adding these paranormal experiences or mystical experiences that people have? The more and more you bring to the table, it does dictate what your theory is going to come out with, what arguments you're going to have. But I want as much stuff on the table as possible. And I like weird stuff too. That I find the weird to be intriguing. We'll talk about that word a little bit more. Another question that I've been thinking about a lot in my own work is, do you just, when you're studying and doing analysis of religion, do you study only what's going on right now? Or do you study what's historical? I tend to study what's historical and textual, but what if you begin to study what's current? For instance, I wrote a paper, sort of worked on a paper with a friend of mine in which I found all of these, she was writing about a specific goddess, and I found all these magic rituals that invoked this goddess. And then she was able to contact, because she's an anthropologist, a bunch of people who were doing these exact practices. I'd never known that people actually did them. She was able to contact them kind of on the phone and using WhatsApp, and found that she could get descriptions of the rituals they were using that matched the textual rituals. So there, we just brought a whole new set of ideas onto the table by having that data of her interviewing people. All right, so Kripal has this kind of wonky but interesting argument about his text being an initiation cycle. So what does the word initiation mean? Well, there are two important theorists of religion. They were both cultural anthropologists, in fact, in the 20th century, named Victor Turner and Arnold von Gunnep. And they posited, by looking at a lot of initiation rituals, especially initiation rituals in traditional African religions, that there's this threefold sort of system in initiation. So first, you're kind of normal and you're in your place you're at. Let's say we're talking about like an African religious ritual. So you're a normal man, you're a young kid, and you approach puberty. And that's the time where you enter the transition period, where you will undergo a ritual that will change you from a boy into a man. In that, you will undergo a ritual in which you will learn new things. You may have ritual scarification. They may do something to your body. You will go through sort of a rite that will signify the change from, in your social and religious status, from man to boy. So Victor Turner comes through and he looks at Van Gennep's work and says, that's tripartite scheme. I see that in all sorts of initiation patterns. What's more interesting, he says, is what's going on in this transition period. There's a space in between not knowing and knowing, and between boy and man when you're undergoing the ritual. And some of these rituals in some cultures, this can be years long, where you're in a liminal state and an in-between state between man and boy, in which all sorts of things can happen. He calls this the liminal. And the liminal, or the place in between, is a place where everything is sort of challenged and all sorts of new things come up. So it's a place that's very useful. Kripal's going to argue, in fact, that we just did this couple of chapters talking about the history of the study of religion. Now we're going to enter in the point where we're comparing. We're going to compare a wide range of religious data, and we're in a liminal space. We don't really know what to think of religion in this space, because everything about religion is going to, and what we usually thought about religion, is going to become challenged. And then eventually, it will have incorporation, where we take what we've seen and we get all shook up about our notions of religion to come up with our own better understandings of religion based on what we've been doing. So here's some examples real quick. So I've got this Indian guy who's by his sheep there. There's a group called the Vratyas. Now, these are found in early Indian scriptures. The Vratyas were Brahmin men who reached the age of about 20. And they left their homes and they would be gone for several years. And what they do is they kind of live in the woods, and this is a temporary state, but it could go on for quite a while. And they're said to be ferocious and terrifying, and to speak with harsh tongues, and to do strange rites, and to eat strange foods. Well, what they're really doing right now then is they were cattle rustling. They didn't have the startup capital to really start their own household. So they would get in this liminal spot where they weren't quite in society, but they weren't quite off, and they'd go and steal other householders' cows. And then they would return and become proper Brahmins and live out their lives. What about some other one? You see this Dabang? Well, that is Wang. The Tibetan language is funny. So Wang means ritual initiation. You have to do a Wang in order to perform any type of specific religious practice. This involves you go into a room, and the Lama, the sort of the teacher, has invoked a deity and created a ritual space all around. You sit in that room, sometimes with many other people, and he reads the text to you about how to do the practice. Then he guides you through doing the practice, and then he sends you on your way to go do the practice on your own and incorporate it into your life. What are some other ones? What about your driver's license? You go from not being able to drive, but you get a learner's permit in between. So you go from not knowing how to drive, you go to driver's ed, that's sort of liminal, then you get your learner's permit for a while, and then you finally get your driver's license. It's one of the big rites of passage in our world. Another one you could think of is confirmation, say in the Catholic Church. You may have been baptized, and that got you set up in the Catholic community, and then you go through your CCD, and then you do whatever you need to do, and then you have the ritual of confirmation, or what we have in the Protestant community is the profession of faith, and then you go forth as a full adult Catholic. All right, so Kripal argues that his very book is an initiation, and he says that at this point we're about to enter the liminal. Like I said, we've studied very conventional religions at this point. We're going to start to get a little wild and woolly from here on out and really start looking at some kind of crazy ideas. The exciting thing that we're going to talk about today is one of the thorniest problems in religion, which is the study of magic. And what is magic? Now, the liminal space is an uncomfortable one, but it holds great possibility. So let's think about how we can destabilize our ideas of religion and move on to challenge ourselves. I mean, the question is, can we force ourselves into this state of confusion and liminality? And I would say we can. And you should also think of this as a journey. Remember, we talk about theory, theoria, from Greek, as a journey. So you're comfortable in your own space, but you've become unsatisfied. So you go to the foreign land, and you discover things, you learn things, and then you come back and you reincorporate into society and figure what you have and share what you have learned. And you're changed. So on that journey that we are about to take, where are we going? What are we doing? Well, our path along this journey is the path of religions. So I want to one more time go through some definitions of religion. So E.B. Tyler, who you can see on the bottom on the right, says, it seems best simply to claim as a minimum definition of religion the belief in spiritual beings. All right, we can work with that. William James, the founder of the psychology of religion, says, religion is the feelings, acts, and experiences of individual men in their solitude, so far as they apprehend themselves to stand in religion to whatever they may consider the divine. So for him, it's a personal experience. Paul Tillich, the guy with the mustache and or the guy with the cigar and the sunglasses, said, religion is the state of being the most ultimate concern. So he said, what is the most important thing to you? That absolute most important thing, that is religion. And we should exist in a state in which we are dwelling in the state of the most ultimate concern, being the divine or prayer or whatever. He was Protestant Christian. So moving right along, we have Clifford Geertz here at the top, very much the founder of ethnography and cultural anthropology in many ways. He argues a religion is 1, a system of symbols which acts to 2, establish powerful, pervasive, and long-lasting moods and motivations in men by 3, formulating conceptions of a general order of existence, and 4, clothing these conceptions with such an aura of factuality that 5, the moods and motivations seem uniquely realistic. So he's Geertz, and it makes sense that Geertz would argue this. It's very much the whole structure of society around religion, and that it is so compelling that one would see those religious beliefs as just being real and correct and inherently true. And then we got my man, Melford Spiro, who argues, what is religion but an institution consisting of culturally patterned interaction with culturally postulated superhuman beings? I stand by that one. That one makes sense to me. And then finally, we have Mr. Jeffrey Kripal once again. So he sets out a definition, in fact, an explicit definition here in our textbook. And he says that religion is any set of established stories, ritual performances, mind disciplines, bodily practices, and social institutions that have been built up over time around extreme encounters with some anomalous presence, energy, hidden order, or power that is experienced as radically other or more. There's a lot I agree with in here, but I get stuck on this notion of the encounter. I think there's a lot of times we don't actually encounter these divinities or this greater power or, you know, or the little beasties that are invisible. And even if we don't encounter them, we transact with them. And I just think that we need to be key in understanding that it's about sort of transaction. Okay, so do any of these definitions work? I mean, what they have to do is they have to account for any definition of religion that you work with has to account for, one, your own religious experiences, two, religious experiences dictated to you by other individuals, so what people tell you about religion, your own religious experiences and what people tell you about religion, and finally, religious lore and cultures encountered in person or in media. So where you go, whenever you go and encounter a new religion, that's also part of it. And a lot of people would argue that if you're going to posit a definition of religion, it has to be universal to all religions. I'm back and forth on that one. Maybe you will think so, though. All right, let's break this down. This is the middle section of our lecture where I run you through a problem. Now, we're going to be talking about magic a little bit more at the end of the lecture. So what I'm going to run you through is how to use Kripal's model of comparison in order to come to a conclusion. This is the type of comparison that I want you to use in your comparison assignments. So the first thing we do is we collect and describe. Here we're going to talk about magic rituals versus magic power or magic powers. When I say magic rituals, I mean ritual actions that cause an effect in the world based on a ritual action. When I say magic powers, I mean superhuman abilities. And we'll get into these details more as we go into step two. Step two, classification and naming patterns. Remember, we're talking about magic rituals and we're talking about magic powers. Magic rituals, such as execration to get an entity away from you, cursing someone, making them bad, they're often aggressive. They will have things like healing illnesses, but the important thing to see is that these are specific things that happen. These are the results of magic rituals. But with magic powers, what are the results? Well, we have this word siddhi in Sanskrit. It means a perfection. Now, perfection can be to grow very high, very tall, very short, to make your body very heavy, to make your body very light, to bilocate, to be in two positions at the same time, to never have to eat, never have to excrete, to perform miracles. So I'm thinking in the Hindu context, but I think there's a larger argument here that I make about when we look at magic, we need to make a distinction between magic rituals and magic powers. All right, so now we're going to do some comparisons. So first off, magic rituals are discrete, but magic powers can be applied widely and can be applied multiple times. So you don't actually need the ritual, and you can deploy the power all the time. So there's one Hindu saint who's known for, who's a perfume saint. So supposedly you can say to him, he'll ask you, what do you want this to smell like? And you'll say sandalwood. And he'll touch your hand and then you can smell it. It'll smell like sandalwood. Well, he doesn't have to do a ritual to do that. He just does it every time. In magic rituals versus magic powers, we are looking how the ritual must be done every time to get results. Now, the power of the magic ritual could be the result of the ritual, but it's not ongoing. So it's not, I mean, you could repeat the ritual over and over again and get the same result. Presumably you would, but you can't do it without the ritual, as I keep saying. With magic rituals, they are often aggressive, surprisingly, as you read through literature on magic rituals throughout history and across cultures, it's surprisingly aggressive and hostile. Whereas magic powers are often quite a bit less effective, or quite a bit less aggressive. Now, you learn a ritual from somewhere. You read it out of a book or someone teaches it to you, but powers are gained from your own personal religious practice, or they are given to you by God, or they are the element of God's grace within you that they manifest. Ritual is effective by perfect performance, whereas magic powers are sort of ever existent. And finally, as we're looking at all of this, there's another odd pattern, and that is, what is the magical? Magical. So magical is an adjective or an adverb that describes something surprising, something odd, or something that someone is exceptionally good at. So if I see a really great basketball player, I would say, that guy's almost magical. So magical is an adjective, but magic rituals are in actions, and magic powers are abilities. So there, we've taken these concepts, and now we're comparing to come to a larger idea. So here's my kind of wordy thing, and this is actually a paper I wrote. So all of the uses of the English term magic are not the same. Magic can refer to a ritual that changes the world, a power that is deployed, or a miracle, or a surprising event. Different types of magic, or magical. Magic rites and magic rituals are also not the same, though they are both described as magical. Magic rites are discrete actions with discrete results that work as long as they are done properly, though they may coerce a superhuman entity to perform the result. We'll talk more about that in a minute. Magic powers are gained through charisma, piety, ritual. Magic powers are gained through charisma, piety, ritual exertion, or the grace of God, and do not require rituals. They may be used whenever necessary and may be repeated without losing that very power. Separating magic power, magic rituals, and the magical, as in the adjective, demonstrates three meanings of the term magic in religious discourse. So you see how the process leads to our general theory of religion. We're not saying these are the same or they're different. We're looking at similarities and we're looking at differences in order to make a larger overall claim. All right, so magic, a case study. That's our case study for today and for our next lesson, which we're specifically going to look at Indian magical traditions. All right, so the last part of our lecture. So we have this word magic. Well, where does it come from? The English term magic comes from the Greek term magus, and plural, magoi, and then we also have this word that's filtered through biblical literature of the magi, the three kings from the east. So who are these magoi? Well, they were experts in dream interpretation and astrology. Dream interpretation is called onirancy. They were priests. They had secret knowledges. They were also known as kings. So we see that magic, even as it begins to enter our discourse, comes through Greek and does talk about the East. Magic comes from the East, the place where the sun rises. So we see actually that the acts of Christ in the Gospels resemble quite a bit of other charismatic magic men at the time. There were a lot of these charismatic men with, in fact, magical powers, not exactly doing magic rituals. However, if you look into the Hellenistic world, we discovered a large body of magic rituals that are preserved in a body of text called Greek magical papyri. But that is another story. Okay, we're not talking about stage magic. We're not talking about prestidigitation or legerdemain. Those are kind of my favorite words for sleight of hand. We're not talking about creating illusions or stagecraft. So traditionally, well, not traditionally, but in the history of the use of the term magic, Protestants would critique Catholics for doing what they called magic, for doing what they called magic masses. Now, we have a stagecraft magical word when I pull a rabbit out of my hat, I say, hocus pocus. Well, intriguingly, this comes from the phrase hoc est enim corpus meus, which I guess when the priests would mutter it, which they would say as the transubstantiation was occurring, that the host would become, the very communion wafer would become the very blood and flesh of Christ. It would sound like hoc est corpus meus, hocus pocus. That's just kind of a fun one. So originally the Christians would talk about magic and their rejection of magic to deny their connection to pagans. Now remember, what's the word pagan, but paganos, which means villagers. So to keep away from the traditional polytheists that the early Christians would have been reacting against. Later, Protestants began to say this mass that you're doing and this changing of blood to, or of wine to blood, this is magic. It's effectively magic what you're doing, and that's not what we do. We're rational, good Protestants. So, you know, it's kind of funny when you think about this, how this discourse of magic is used to really separate people. I know there are people today that consider themselves practitioners of magic, for instance, modern Wiccans, and they also use the term pagan from pagano. They say villager, they're polytheists. And, you know, I find them to be quite pious people who are very legitimately and legitimately dedicated to their religious practice and their religious beliefs. It makes you wonder how magic is always othering. So while I do prayer, everybody else does magic. The question is, how different are prayer and magic? And that's a big theological argument that I'll describe in a second right here. Now, when I describe magic, and the definition I quite like for it is pragmatic ritual techniques. So what are some examples here? Well, you have Buddhists who have amulets. Well, there's nothing about amulets in Buddhism, but what they do is they take these sort of charmed amulets that can be made from all sorts of rare ingredients, even the bones of famous monks and the ashes of all sorts of, and the ashes of corpses. And they wear them to ward off evil or give them strength or give them power. A friend of mine does research on them, and I asked, you know, do you ever find Buddhist monks doing rituals to aggressively kill others? And he says no, but what they will do is they'll make amulets to protect people they know that are physically going to go out and harm others, specifically Muslims. Yes, the Buddhists in all over Southeast Asia are remarkably Islamophobic, and there's quite a bit of Buddhist-Muslim violence, especially these days. What about ishtikara? So this is a practice within Islam in which one goes to an expert and you tell them their problem, and then they go and they open up a Quranic verse and they'll interpret it in a specific way to solve your problem. Well, that's kind of surprising. And there's the evil eye. Oh, I forgot to get a picture of this. Sorry. So the evil eye is the notion that, and this is common in the Middle East and in India, is the idea that someone can look upon you with like jealousy and it will just like curse you. So especially in the Mediterranean, they'll wear these very specific sort of like blue ingot looking like types of like sort of beads and whatnot that sort of look like an eye. And the idea is that it wards off the evil eye, or it absorbs the power of the evil eye and keeps it from hurting you. But what about a petitionary prayer? Like straight up. I mean, it's one thing when you're praying to worship God, but when you're saying, dear God, get me a good grade on this test. One would say they're asking God or requesting to God, but aren't they sort of compelling God? I mean, what if God doesn't give that to you? Does that mean that God doesn't exist? So the petitionary prayer in which you are asking God for something gets a little confusing and sort of looks a little bit more like a magic spell than one might initially think. So, I mean, I've made this argument that's kind of a silly one, but I do think there's something to it. If there is a universal religion or formative religious experience anywhere, it is going out to the woods. It is going away from society. It is making offerings and saying prayers or saying spells to invoke an entity, and that entity will appear in one way or another, whether it's funny sounds or physically appearing to you or just gusts of wind. And then you make a request, and if you are brave, you get the request. If you're terrified, that thing kills you. So this is kind of an idea that I see in a lot of different cultures. I'm particularly interested in it in India. Okay, so magic causes change, as I've said over and over again. The magician believes that the ritual he or she performs actually causes a change, but a believer believes that only God can cause a change. A critique of magic offered by Durkheim is that magic compels a God, but God can't be compelled. He's God. On the other hand, what about an angel? Can you get an angel to do your bidding to get you what you need? Isn't that a little different? Where do angels exist between man and God? But if you believe that prayer causes God to do something by petitioning him, is that not magic and the compulsion of a God? Or they have votive masses, and I go round and round with a priest buddy of mine on that about how votive masses are just magic. And he says, and a votive mass is when you do a mass on a specific occasion, like if you're getting into graduate school, or you've applied to a whole bunch of colleges and you need to get in, so you offer a mass or sponsor a mass, and it's done for you to get into graduate school. For me, that sounds like you're trying to compel God. And the priests I talk to are like, no, it doesn't compel God to do it. We're just doing it to hopefully have it happen or influence him to maybe if we ask him to actually have it for us. And my head swings around about this notion of religion and magic in this case. So back to good old Max Weber. Max Weber argued in an essay called Science as a Vocation that all legitimate knowledge requires the exorcism of superstition and magic. Weber describes the disenchantment of the West, in which only the rational and material is considered valid, right? Now, he doesn't deny God's existence. He's more of a deist on this, but he says that God's irrelevant. So this leads to what he calls the disenchantment of the world, where we no longer need gods and magic and angels and whatnot, and we can just look at the material world. A lot of people have said, but this really only describes the Germany that he lives in, and only the elite Germany that he lives in. This doesn't refer to, big changes in the culture of the average man in the street in Germany. And this definitely does not apply to, once again, India, where people are happily polytheist and believe in miracles and believe in magic and all of this, and at the same time have very sophisticated, high-tech engineering jobs. They hold these two ideas very simply. So also to this, Weber says that this idea of disenchanting the world is rooted in Protestantism, and that disenchantment of the world is what causes science to really happen. But in reality, the roots of science are further back than the Protestant religion. They're found in the Renaissance, in which there were lots of people that practiced, and lots of scientists, even Newton, Sir Isaac Newton, was a practicing alchemist, practicing the transformation of lead into gold and using those same practices to turn man into immortal man, normal man into God man. In fact, when we look at what we call the natural magic in the earliest sort of late medieval and Renaissance era, it's the idea that you can manipulate the elements, so earth, water, fire, and space. You can manipulate those in ways to cause changes and effects in the world. This is where we start seeing early, effectively, scientists trying to understand how water is connected to air. And sure, they might believe that fire exists inside of wood, and that when you touch a little bit of fire to that wood, all the fire comes out because it lives within that. But that's the beginning of thinking about science and causation. So in fact, while Max Weber may argue for the disenchantment of the world creating modern science, I would argue that it was early natural magic and alchemy and the Renaissance that really gets the scientific method going. So Jeffrey Kripal has a very specific definition of magic, to no degree, to no surprise. And he argues that magic is a ritual act done publicly or in private that uses a correspondence between interior states and an external event. The internal or subjective affects the external or objective. Magic works through hidden intentions and correspondences, not by mechanical or material correspondence. The idea that Kripal has here is that by changing one's interior space or getting one's will set in a certain way, they can change the external world. He misses, for me, the actual ritual act of it. He's very much more interested in, like I said, the interior affecting the exterior. Whereas I think the key to understanding magic is actually microcosm and macrocosm. Microcosm, small world; macrocosm, greater world. The idea is if you do a ritual, which is a little world in and of itself, you can cause a change in the actual world. So to use one example of pop culture, the voodoo doll, which has next to nothing to do with actual voodoo, the Afro-Caribbean religion. You make an effigy of a person, you stick a pin in its heart, they have a heart attack. The idea is the thing you do in the little world affects the big world. It shows that the little world and the big world are inherently connected. This isn't your usual material causation. It's not like I take a gun and I shoot a guy and I kill him. That's the material world affecting him. Or I stab somebody and that stops their heart. It is positing that I can put the soul, or that I can, the soul of the person, or that I can create a ritual space that is able to, by virtue of its being a reflection of the greater space, that if I manipulate that smaller space, it will affect the greater space. It's a technique of correspondences. Look no further in this than listening to, I don't know, middle-aged white women talk about manifesting stuff. Like, if you just manifest it, it will happen. If you manifest a good health within you, your joint pains will go away. If you make a vision board with all your dreams upon it, you will get those things. This is very common in a New Age book that was just sort of specifically called The Secret, that was about manifesting these types of things. I would argue that Kripal's idea has more connections to American metaphysical religion and what we called New Thought, which was sort of think prosperously and grow wealthy, rather than sort of the magic rituals that I'm most concerned in. And maybe that's because I put certain things on the table that Jeffrey Kripal doesn't, and he definitely puts things on the table that I don't. I'm not interested in the interior state affecting the exterior world. I'm interested in somebody doing something that in a somewhat irrational way causes something else to happen. Well, what about witchcraft as we close down here? Witchcraft doesn't exist. Now, you have modern people that say they practice witchcraft, the craft, or Wicca, neo-pagans and whatnot. They're not doing what's called witchcraft. When I say witchcraft, I'm really talking about an anthropological category that summarizes accusations. So while people may not be witches, people are accused of being witches. I read every day about someone who's accused of black magic. They've never actually done any black magic. They're accused of doing it, and then the people around them kill them. That's what was happening in Salem. Goody Goodwife did not do any black magic, but she surely was burned at the stake for it. So witch trials. Now, we do have a thing that's often described as witchcraft called leechcraft or natural magic. Leechcraft is sort of folk remedies. You know, the idea of there's a lady who lives in the edge of town, and if you go and hang out with her, she'll make you a poultice or a magic, or she'll make you some magical concoction that will cause you to be cured of all your ills. That's called actually leechcraft. Now, this is still with us, and I want to be clear, we're not talking about witchcraft. And it could be something we do at some other point. But it's still with us, this idea of accusing people of doing horrific things that are religious or in fact rituals that they haven't done in order to justify persecuting them. In the 1980s, there was something that happened called the Satanic Panic. I grew up during it, and there were a number of people that were accused of starting or of being Satanists performing satanic rituals at daycares. In time, these accusations wildly spread around, and a lot of these people lost their jobs. Some of them were in prison for many, many, many years. In time, we found that the majority of the descriptions of these satanic rituals by children were coaxed by their interrogators or their parents, and the cycle just got wild in which more and more people were accused of doing this witchcraft that they didn't do. None of these people were Satanists. They were just people that worked in daycare that for some reason they got swept up in this. And if you're following what's going on in 2020, does this sound a little like QAnon? Does it sound a little like Pizzagate? Be wary when people are describing others as being inherently evil and in allegiance to the devil. I will also note to you, in all of my many walkings to and forth across the earth, I've met a lot of Satanists in my time, but I've never met someone that murders babies. I've never met someone who has an occult criminal underground. I get to some pretty weird places, and I have never seen any of the descriptions of this satanic underground of baby eating, I don't know, whatever, of baby eating rapists. They don't exist. There is occasionally horrible crimes that happen, and people will say that it was caused by some sort of satanic whatnot, but we never see a network an underground network of Satanists out to get everybody. Trust me, I'd have found it by now. I've been looking. All right, so what is magic? Does it work? What does it do? Well, I'm going to give you my last overall argument about magic. Magic is a ritual action that seeks to reduce the pain of an individual, though it may seek to cause pain to other individuals. I accept that it doesn't work materially. I don't think it works. People often ask me when I give lectures on magic, they're like, does it work? And I'm like, no. And they're like, have you tried it? And I'm like, if it did work, would I want to? Because most of these magic rituals that I study are pretty aggressive and pretty hostile. But magic does work. So while this tiny ritual I don't think actually affects this big bad world out there, though I could be proved wrong, magic does work. Even when it doesn't work, it works. Magic removes the pain of inertia when all else is lost. When you can't get what you so desperately desire and you feel such pain because you can't get that, then you can do a magic ritual and you'll feel a little bit better because you won't feel the inertia. You won't feel completely flummoxed and stuck. Or rather, it focuses the mind, it focuses the will. You can do a magic ritual to get your head focused in the right direction, and that will cause you to have a better way of living and of being effective in the world. And this is the way a lot of modern practitioners of magic describe magic. Okay, we have reached the end, but our journey will continue. I will see you next time.